Doug was driving, heading down a familiar street with all those nice houses on it. He drove past his neighbors' flower beds, where they always competed to see who could grow the prettiest petunias. And then he pulled up to his own yard. There was a light shining out from the kitchen window upstairs. And for just a second, his heart skipped a beat. Home, Lisa. The thought that things were still normal gave him a sense of comfort. But then, that was where he made his mistake. He'd stopped noticing the small things for so long. When he walked inside, he could smell the faint scent of that lavender air freshener that Lisa always used. She was standing in the kitchen, putting something together on plates. Her motions were quick, but somehow distant. "How was your day?" he asked as he kicked off his shoes and walked into the room. "I'm good," she replied without looking up from her task. Dinner was served, but he realized she wasn't sitting down with him at the table. She just stood there like she was thinking about something. "Hey, listen, I got a meeting at the office today," Lisa said suddenly, as she was putting her keys and phone into her bag. "I'll be really late." "What kind of meeting is it?" Doug asked, surprised. "Aren't those usually on Fridays?" "Yeah, but we changed the schedule at the last minute." "See you later," she replied, running out the door. A minute later, she was gone. Doug sat at the kitchen table, staring at his dinner. He mechanically turned a potato around with his fork, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong. Lisa drove through the city, listening to her heart beat as she thought about Ben. He was so young, only 29, but he had so much life and adventure in him. Next to him, Lisa felt like she could be herself. Their nightly texts and secret glances at meetings drew her in like a magnet. When she arrived at Ben's apartment, he greeted her with a huge smile and hug. Her heart raced like it hadn't in years. They held each other in silence, and she felt needed. Here, she wasn't just a wife or mother. She was just herself. "What's wrong?" Ben asked, kissing her neck. She whispered, "I'm scared it will end." He laughed, "And what if we don't want it to?" These words were like a breath of fresh air for Lisa. She knew she had to go home eventually, but for the time being, she could just pretend that there wasn't any other life out there. Doug, on the other hand, was lying on the couch with his phone in hand, scrolling through news articles. Time seemed to drag on forever, and the night never seemed to end. Eventually, after midnight, he turned off the lights and headed to bed alone. Lisa, on the other side of the room, was sitting on Ben's bed just staring at his sleeping form. He was talking in his sleep, something light and funny that always made her smile. But tonight, she didn't say a word. The room felt heavy with a sense of longing. Ben, young and confident, was just like every other young person she knew. Next to him, she felt like she belonged, like she had escaped the stress and worry of her everyday life with Doug. There was no talk of money, plans for retirement, or household chores that had been weighing on her for so long. Ben turned and gave her a smile like she was the only one in the world. "What's up?" he asked, giving her a pat on the shoulder. "Just thinking about." She paused, surprising herself with her honesty. "I don't want to leave." He pulled her closer, and she melted into his embrace, like all her doubts were gone. But Lisa knew it was just temporary. As soon as she walked out the door, real life would hit her again. Waiting for her was Doug, with his unspoken expectations, heavy like concrete. He'd never ask, "What do you want?" or "Missing anything?" For him, marriage was a set mechanism that didn't need changing. But for Lisa, it felt like a cage. That evening, Doug found himself all alone at home. He noticed that lately, Lisa had been spending more and more time at her work events. This was starting to bother him a bit. His gut feeling, which he'd been ignoring for a while, finally started to ring a warning bell. He grabbed his phone and started scrolling through Lisa's Instagram posts. Nothing seemed suspicious. Everything looked so perfect. Her smiles from charity events, pictures with friends. It was actually this perfection that started to worry him. Lisa had always been so open. Her emotions were always clear as day. But now, she seemed to be hiding behind those fake smiles. The next day, at work, Doug decided to talk about his concerns with his co-worker and longtime friend Mike. "Maybe you're just overthinking it?" Mike leaned back in his chair, seemingly uninterested in the conversation. "All wives change over time, man. My wife wants more me time too. It's just the age thing, don't stress about it." But Doug couldn't get rid of the feeling that something more was going on in their marriage than just space. He noticed that Lisa was texting him less and was more often glued to her phone. They were small things, but that's how betrayal starts. Lisa kept seeing Ben, enjoying every second of her freedom. Their meetings were like a breath of fresh air to her. Her life, which used to be boring and predictable, was suddenly full of excitement and passion. But the guilt was creeping up on her more and more. One day, in bed with Ben, she was torn by conflicting feelings. She knew this couldn't go on forever. But when the time came, what would she choose? Do you think he knows something? Ben asked softly, wrapping his arm around her. I don't know, Lisa admitted. He never asks questions. That's the worst part. Ben gave her a serious look. You deserve better, Lisa. Those words seemed to echo in her head. She did deserve it, but what exactly? More freedom or another chance at a relationship that had long since lost its spark? Doug woke up a bit earlier than usual. Around 6 a.m., he couldn't get back to sleep. In the empty bed next to him, he saw Lisa's pillow left behind. Her late night returned the night before had bothered him. Everything seemed normal. She quietly came in, changed her clothes, and laid down at the edge of the bed without touching him. But something in her demeanor, the way she avoided eye contact, was off. For a long time, he stared at the ceiling, wondering how they'd fallen into this routine. He remembered when they first started dating. Those evening walks, late-night conversations, her laughter filling the room. Now their house was silent. When Lisa woke up, she reached for her phone on the bedside table, as if checking for something important. Doug noticed the gesture, but it was quick, like it was automatic. He didn't like that detail. Do you have anything important going on today? He asked, hoping to catch something in her tone. Nope, just a meeting at the office tonight, she replied, scrolling through her messages. Doug nodded, but he couldn't hide his irritation this time. She seemed calm as ever, but there was something cold about her demeanor that he'd never seen before. He decided he couldn't ignore his suspicions anymore. On the same day, Doug went to work, but thoughts of Lisa wouldn't leave his mind. At lunchtime, he checked her social media and went through all her posts again. Nothing seemed out of place. Everything looked perfect. That in itself was suspicious, though. Lisa was usually so open with him, but now it felt like an invisible wall had come between them. On the way home, he stopped by his friend Mike's place, hoping to talk things through. They sat on the porch with beers and Doug spilled his guts about what was up. You think she's cheating? Mike raised his eyebrows in disbelief. Lisa? Come on, man. She doesn't seem like that. I know, Doug replied, staring into his beer bottle. But I'm not so sure anymore. She's been acting so distant lately. Maybe she's bored? Mike suggested. We all get tired of routines, right? Take her out, surprise her. Doug wanted to believe it was just that simple. But some inner voice kept whispering there was more to it. Lisa got home late that night. She was still wearing the same clothes she left in the morning, jeans and a shirt, but there was something different about her. Her eyes were sparkling, and she had a little smile on her face, like she'd brought a piece of another world with her. Doug met her in the hall, arms crossed. How was the meeting? He asked. Great, Lisa replied with a quick smile, brushing past him. He watched her go upstairs and felt a surge of anger and confusion. It wasn't the Lisa he knew. She was someone else, and it was driving him nuts. One night, Lisa left her phone on the kitchen counter, and Doug couldn't take it anymore. He snatched it up and started scrolling through her messages. At first, it looked like nothing out of the ordinary, just texts with friends and work stuff. But then, he saw a name that made his heart skip a beat. Ben. Doug opened the conversation and read through it, his heart pounding in his chest. The messages were full of flirty stuff, jokes, emojis, and phrases like, can't wait to see you, and you were so hot today. It all seemed so obvious now. Suddenly, Doug realized that Lisa had been cheating on him the whole time. He felt like the world had just come crashing down around him. Slowly, he put the phone down and stood there, unsure of what to do. A million questions raced through his mind, but the biggest one of all was why? Why would she do this to him? Why couldn't she just be honest? He decided he wasn't going to make a big deal out of it right now. He needed time to figure out what to do next, but one thing was for sure. Their old life was over. That night, he was lying awake again, listening to Lisa breathing softly next to him. She was sleeping peacefully, like there was nothing on her conscience. On his phone, Ben was replying to messages like, "Good night, beautiful. See you soon," and it sounded like a hammer in his head. The next morning, Lisa woke up first and stretched like nothing had happened. Doug watched her from the corner of his eye, studying her every move. Everything about her annoyed him. The way she moved so lightly, the calmness on her face, the way she casually slammed the closet door when choosing clothes. How could she live two lives so easily? He thought. From the kitchen, Lisa said, "I've got a meeting with the foundation partners for lunch." As she poured herself a cup of coffee, Doug wondered how she could be so calm about everything. Another meeting? Doug tried to keep his tone neutral, but there was a hint of sarcasm in his voice. She just nodded, ignoring his tone, and grabbed her phone from the table, completely unaware that he knew her secret. When she left, Doug sat on the couch, staring blankly ahead. His hands were trembling, and he was torn between rage and pain. What should he do next? Should he cause a scene right away? That would give her the upper hand. She could make excuses or blame him, like women sometimes do when backed into a corner. No, he needed to think this through. Doug didn't want to react impulsively. He needed proof, undeniable proof. So he decided to watch her. Lisa went to Ben's place that day and Doug followed. He tried to not think about what would happen when they got there. He probably wasn't ready for the truth, but it was too late to turn back. Doug stood on the other side of the street, watching Lisa walk into Ben's apartment. It all seemed so casual. If Doug didn't know better, he would have thought it was a normal visit. But then he realized that behind those doors was a life Lisa hadn't shared with him. For 2 hours, Doug sat in his car, feeling all his emotions flip. He wanted to run into that place, make a scene, and push the other guy out. But he knew anger could be his downfall. So, he had to stay calm. When Lisa finally came home, Doug was waiting for her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a whiskey bottle and 2 glasses. She stopped in the doorway, eyebrows raised in surprise. "So, are you going to drink by yourself?" she asked with a smile, trying to act casual. "No," Doug replied calmly, nodding at the second glass. "Sit down. We need to talk." Something about his tone alerted her, and she froze, like an animal senses danger. "About what?" Her voice became cautious, almost defensive. "Your meetings with Ben," Doug said, staring her straight in the eyes. Lisa went pale. Her face blanked out, like someone who realizes they're cornered. "What? What are you talking about?" She tried to play it off, but her voice cracked. "There's no point in lying, Lisa. I know everything." His words were soft, but there was steel in them. She collapsed into a chair, like her legs couldn't hold up after what had just happened. They looked at each other for a few silent seconds, as every year they'd been together flashed before their eyes. "How long has this been going on, man?" Doug asked, trying to keep his anger in check. Lisa put her hands over her face and whispered, "I didn't want things to end up like this. I was just confused." Those words only made him even more angry. He clenched his fists so hard that his knuckles went white. "Confused," he spat. There was so much hurt in his voice that it made Lisa cringe. "And that's why you decided to cheat with a younger guy?" She didn't know how to answer. She tried to say something, but her words got stuck in her throat. "Is that all there is to it?" Doug asked bitterly. "Our years together mean nothing to you?" "No, they do," she said, lowering her eyes. "But I felt like a stranger to myself for a while now." That hit Doug harder than the actual betrayal. He realized he'd lost her long before that guy showed up, and that was the worst realization of all. Doug was sitting there, trying to process what he'd learned. Lisa looked at him and realized she'd hurt him more than she meant to. The situation was still so open-ended, neither of them knew what would happen next. Doug felt like the world had just shifted beneath him, but he kept a cool, collected facade. He poured some whiskey into 2 glasses and pushed one toward Lisa. She looked at him over her glass, confused and overwhelmed. She seemed like she wanted to pretend it was all a bad dream, but Doug wasn't about to let that happen. "You know, I've been wondering when you were going to tell me," he said, slowly bringing the glass to his lips. Lisa paused for a moment, trying to figure out how to respond. "I don't know. It just kind of happened, you know." Doug laughed. "Yeah, I guess so." Those words might have sounded funny if they weren't talking about his own situation. "So, are you just saying that you found someone else and everything just worked out on its own?" His voice was sharp, like a knife slicing through the air. Lisa let out a heavy sigh, like she knew her excuses were going to fall flat. "Do you think it's been easy for me?" she asked, her voice tinged with pain. "I've felt invisible next to you for so long. You were always at work. All you cared about were bills and the house in order. Me? I might as well not exist." Doug repeated her words softly, almost to himself. "Invisible? I worked for us, for our family. I thought it was enough." "No, it wasn't," Lisa cut in. "You thought if we didn't argue, everything would be fine. But that's not how it works. We lost touch a long time ago. Ben just made me feel alive again." Those words struck Doug harder than he could have imagined. All the work he'd put into their marriage, all his efforts, had been for nothing. She wanted passion and connection, not stability. "So what now?" Doug asked, leaning back in his chair. "Are you going to leave me for him?" Lisa buried her face in her hands and shook her head. "I don't know," she said. "I just don't know what I want." Those words were so painful. They showed that even after all that had happened, she still wasn't sure about her future, whether it was with him or someone else. The next day, Doug and Lisa moved around the house like ghosts, avoiding each other. They ate breakfast in silence, lost in their thoughts. Doug felt like he was living in someone else's home, a home he had built, but nothing made sense anymore. At one point, he stepped outside and sat on the porch, staring at the trees for a long time. He tried to figure out what would happen next. Forgive him? Forget it all? Could he forget that the person he had been with for over a decade had betrayed him so easily? That evening, Lisa made an attempt to start a conversation. I don't want to lose everything, Doug," she said softly. "Maybe we can try again?" He looked at her with a long, weary gaze. "Again?" he repeated. "How do you expect it to work then? Do I just forget all that I've learned and pretend like nothing happened?" She didn't answer. "Liza," he looked at her in a way she'd never seen before. "We can't bring back what we lost. We can only move forward. But I don't know if I have it in me to do that." Doug leaned against the counter, his hands clenched into fists. Exhaustion washed over him, not just physical, but a deeper kind that comes from the soul when you realize something precious has been taken away. In an instant, their entire marriage flashed before him. The wedding day, the birth of their kids, plans for their future. All of it had been a fragile dream, shattered by someone else's actions. Lisa stood in front of Doug with her arms crossed, like she was trying to protect herself. She had a look of fear in her eyes, like she knew something bad was about to happen. She didn't say anything, but she felt like every step she took was going to be a big decision. Doug spoke up quietly, but firmly. "You need to leave," he said, without taking his eyes off the table. Even he was surprised by what he said, but as soon as the words left his mouth, he knew it was the right thing to do. "What?" Lisa stared at him like she couldn't believe her ears. "Doug, wait." "Leave, Lisa," he said louder, and this time there was no anger or sadness in his voice. Just the determination of a decision he'd made. "We're through. Are you serious?" There was a hint of panic in Lisa's voice. She tried to move forward, but Doug held up his hand like a stop sign. "I've waited a long time, you know. I try to understand, man. I really did. But I just can't take it anymore. It's pointless." "Listen, Doug, let me explain." Lisa tried again, but he cut her off. "No, that's it. That's all I have to say. You made your choice, and now it's my turn. I don't need you here. Just pack your stuff and go." Lisa felt like she'd been hit by a lightning bolt. Everything she thought was solid was suddenly crumbling. She knew this moment was coming, but she wasn't ready for it. "But where am I supposed to go? What do I do?" she asked, her voice soft and quiet. Doug snapped back. "That's none of my business. You didn't think of that when you went off with Ben. Figure it out yourself." His words were cold and final, and Lisa knew there was no point in arguing. Lisa went upstairs and quietly packed a few things in her suitcase. Tears welled in her eyes, but she held them back, not wanting to seem weak. Every step and every zip sounded like the end of her marriage to her. When she came back downstairs, Doug was still there, staring at the ground like she didn't exist. She paused at the doorway, hoping he'd change his mind, say something to stop her. Nothing happened. "Goodbye, Doug," she whispered, knowing he didn't care. He didn't even look up. Lisa left the house, the door slamming behind her with a finality that echoed through the emptiness. Doug stood there for a while, listening to the deafening silence that filled the house. It was heavy, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. It was all over, and he didn't have to keep pretending anymore. No more living with resentment and suspicion, but he didn't really feel any joy either. Just exhaustion. He plopped down on the couch and stared out the window as the light faded. The life he once thought was everything was now just an empty shell. And while he knew he had to start over, he wasn't scared. It was like the end of one chapter and the beginning of a new one. Doug just sat there in silence as the street disappeared into the night. The only sound was his own breathing in a house once filled with so much life. He didn't expect anything anymore. No Lisa coming back, no excuses, no hope for the past to be fixed. It was over. And that's where we come to the end of our story today. If you liked this story and aroused your emotions, please support us with likes and share your impressions in the comments. Your reactions help our stories spread through algorithms. If this is your first time on our channel, join our community by clicking on the subscribe button. This inspires us to create new, interesting stories for you. Thank you for watching the video to the very end. We are waiting for you in the next issue.